Hey now. So we are here, switching up the Voxcast a little bit. It is myself, Justin Schleider. We have Jorge Rodriguez, and we have Dr. Scherz from Teacher Coach. So I'm very excited about this. I had the pleasure of being in a professional development when Dr. Scherz came to my school, ran probably the quickest hour of professional development I've been a part of. Very, very interesting. And right afterwards, I ran up to him and I said, "Sir, we need to get your message out. I would like to interview you." And he was gracious enough to let us. So before we get started, Jorge, you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go right to Dr. Scherz and get rolling.
Yeah, my name is Jorge Rodriguez. I'm a physical education teacher from Houston, Texas, and the producer of the Voxcast. So what we're going to do with this BlabberMouth is we're gonna also produce it as a Voxcast as well, and we'll send it out to everybody with the podcast. So that's who I am.
And all done with the help of Spark, which is cool. Much appreciated. So Dr. Scherz, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's nice to spend the evening with you guys. I'm a psychologist and working on leveling the playing field in education so that all schools have a fair chance to access quality teachers and contemporary technology, so that even schools who are impoverished or don't have access to good resources get the same chances as other schools. You still hear me okay?
Yes, it is beautiful. Good. So can you tell us a little bit about your background? A little bit, where'd you go to school? Why did you get into psychology? What was the impetus behind that?
I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of choice in my career. My mother was a social worker. My father was a psychologist. I tried some other avenues. I even tried working as a congressional intern in D.C. I thought maybe diplomatics might be a good route, but I kept coming back to schools. There was something about working with teachers and kids that sort of just kept calling to me. So I started out my career as an elementary school guidance counselor, and I worked in inner city schools in Chicago. And I even remember working in a supply closet, right? That's the only room that they had for me. And teachers would come in periodically during the sessions and ask for supplies. So that's really where I developed my love of paper.
That's pretty funny. So you started as a guidance counselor. You're working in the supply closet. Where do we go from?
Well, there was a year, I think I was working at a treatment facility, one of those treatment facilities where kids live in teepees. It was a really interesting concept and really cold. I remember one day I had taken the day off. I had been working weeks straight, kids running away at night and spending all hours of the night chasing them down. It was a new place. They weren't really well organized. And as a therapist, my job was to figure out how to do everything, including chasing down runaways. So I took the day off and I was watching the news. And I don't know if you recall, but there was a shooting in Flint, Michigan. There was a first grader who shot another first grader. And it just captured me because I was listening to them. And what really stood out to me was the idea that all the so-called experts were saying, well, it's the fault of the parents, it's the fault of video games, it's the fault of violent television. No one was talking about the health, the organizational health of the school. And I'm a systems therapist. That means that I really pay attention to organizations and levels of system that come together. And I couldn't understand why no one was talking about the health of the schools. So I thought to myself, well, maybe I ought to try and do something. So I started doing a little bit of writing, and I applied to speak at some conferences, and I went out to the National Elementary School Principals Conference in California. And from there, it all started developing, an opportunity to write a book. No one's ever asked me to write a book before. People used to say, I remember my poetry teacher in college, she said something along the lines of, do you have any other backups? Right? Anything else you'd like to do besides write? I said, I'll find something. But it turns out you don't have to be a good writer anymore. You just have to have ideas because there are good editors out there. Right? So I really capitalized.
Can you talk about your book? And I think now it's more pertinent than ever about the subject matter.
Well, I wrote about a number of different topics, but what I really keyed in on was the organizational health of schools and how it tied into school violence. With all the catastrophic shootings and terrible massacres going on across the country, I thought, well, I got to do something to help here. And what I did was I pulled my wife in to help with some of it, and I pulled some other experts in across the country and started looking at school violence from a new perspective, a lens of health and breaking down violence into different types, because you really couldn't treat violence the same in an inner city school as you could in a rural community because there were different causes. So my aim was to help educate people about the different types of violence, to raise some conversations about what violence is and how it develops in different places and what we can do as an organizational culture to reduce the potential for violence, which meant happier teachers, better school culture. And as you know from working in schools, that we've got a long way to go with that. We've still got teachers not making it to year 5. About half the teachers drop out by year 5. Job satisfaction has plummeted about 25%. We've got all kinds of stress, high levels of stress in education, and that's a lot of different reasons. We can get into that as much as you're interested. We've got a real change in this country. We're moving towards choice and accountability, but in brackets, test-based accountability. So what that means is we're moving towards more charter schools and more standardized testing to measure the quality of education. And I think you and I even had a brief conversation about this, that teachers who are on the front line, who know better than anybody how to measure the success of education, don't feel necessarily good about this. Their autonomy is taken away, their freedom of choice is taken away. And how can we expect students to be in the right frame of mind when teachers aren't feeling well supported? It reminds me of, I used to run a mental health organization, a drug and alcohol clinic. And I was initially so focused on the right agenda, structure, having everything in order. But what I was missing out on was the fact that if the people who ran the place weren't happy, they weren't going to be providing good services to the clientele. So I carried that paradigm into my work and into my writing. And since then, I'm trying to make schools healthier and happier places, by and large, by supporting teachers. Because listen, it is the most important profession in the world. And if we're not doing a good job of supporting teachers, we're failing our teachers, then how can we possibly expect to succeed with our children? And I don't know if you saw, there's a recent Gallup poll that came out that said half the students, and this is 1 million students surveyed, half the students reported feeling disengaged. Well, when you look at the statistics on teachers and how poorly they're feeling, their low job satisfaction, it's no wonder.
Yeah, and one of the big things we talked about was how everything's outcomes based. And when you look at only the outcome and you lose the process, I know this sounds familiar to Jorge because we were just talking about this yesterday, you lose a large part of what's going on with the children. And then you sit there at the end and say, all right, if you're good at math and reading, then you're an excellent student, but you're missing the other 99% of the student and then the journey along the way. So that was one of the big things that I took away from your PD there.
Well, what's interesting as well is I've been studying other cultures, and in particular school systems that are rated highest. And Singapore is the highest rated educational system in the world. So I've been researching and trying to understand what they do well. And there are a number of differences that seem to make them successful. One is that they have strong mentorship programs. They put a lot of effort into helping teachers train other teachers. They also have high test-based accountability. However, what's interesting about that, and we'll come back to that because I know it ties into one of the reasons you offered the opportunity to be here, is they have tremendously high levels of anxiety and depression, right? Which seems to be tied into the fact that they put so much emphasis on them to achieve well on tests. But what's also interesting is they also spend about half the time teaching because they have twice the amount of preparatory time to get ready for their lessons.
Well, that was one of the things I want to know when you talked about their ranking, how they were the top ranked. What did they use to rank them?
Yeah, there's an international organization that uses test scores. And that's why one of the reasons why we've moved so heavily in the direction of using tests, because we want to be able to measure ourselves against other countries. It really is just science and math that it comes down to.
Now, does test scores indicate future success of students? Have you run into that? I mean, America's done pretty well so far in creating jobs and having an economy that, I mean, overall seems to be working pretty well. Some of the breakthroughs in science and medicine that have come from our country. I don't know many other countries that are doing and have done what we've done. That might just be me as an American, all egoed up and prideful. But is this valid? What's going on with tests? Should we be looking and saying we're not doing enough in our education?
That's interesting because there's actually just an article that came out in Ed Week just recently, and it was talking about charter schools. Charter schools were originally the idea of a head of a teachers union, right? The National Teachers Union. But what happened was the original ideology behind charter schools was to provide this sense of research and this high-level, sophisticated place to test out theories and concepts and bring in ultimately children who needed an advantage. But what it's become now is a place where we're siphoning off the money and even the resources from the public schools. And the test data is showing that it's not doing a better job. It's in fact polarizing our economy even more. But the three top philanthropists in the world for education have gotten behind this idea of standardization from tests and through this choice, which means charter schools. That's Eli Broad, Bill Gates, and Sam Watson. So you might be familiar with those names. They're the Walmart founder and Barge Insurance. And what they've done is they basically come together and pooled a lot of their resources and applied a lot of influence over our economy. Even our president and the former Arne Collin, the former U.S. Secretary of Education, have been influenced by them. And what they want is a free market economy because they believe that's what worked for them in their business, and that should work with schools. And if we provide more competition, it's going to improve the quality. But in fact, it's done something very different. There's a wonderful book by Diane Ravitch. If anybody is out there in education and wants to understand the evolution of our educational system, it's called something about why schools fail. And it has a lot to do with this move towards standardized testing, which doesn't actually help us improve our grading. It puts more pressure on children. It puts more pressure on teachers. It creates more deception and dishonesty because there's a lot of cheating that goes on. You have teachers who then learn how to teach to the test instead of really teaching kids how to think. It's all about what to think. So instead of being data informed, we're data driven, which means that we look at these outcomes and then we try to gear our teaching towards that. So instead of focusing on curriculum and what's really good instruction and how children learn, it's become more about how do we get that outcome, that final result, and we really lose sight of the process. So in my opinion, it's potentially going to send us even further into problems than we have now.
So I wanted to ask, talking about the anxiety of high stakes testing and how, we are data driven and that's kind of the focus of from the principals and from the top down, really. So what can we do? What can we do as educators to kind of take that anxiety level down from us and also from our students?
Well, when teachers are being graded, in essence, on the outcomes of their students, and sometimes in some districts, their salaries are being tied into their performance, to give any kind of strategy or technique to reduce anxiety is going to be like, a small drop in a large pool. Because if our system is created in a way which pressurizes teachers and students instead of helping people feel more relaxed, more competitive, instead of helping them feel more engaged, it's making them feel more driven to accomplish, this certain end result. And I think as long as we have that kind of system, it's going to keep putting pressure. But I think what we're seeing is a reaction in certain districts that are trying to bring in some mindfulness-based education. I think teachers are also working hard to attend to the emotional needs of students, because when you combine this immediate gratification society, right, everything now is immediate because, right, the advent of technology, we expect to have things right away. And when that's the case, and we match that up with this high pressure, high outcome system with a low tolerance for distress and not being able to hold feelings in abeyance, which means we're not able to regulate our emotions or experience high levels of discomfort, we have now created this perfect storm of anxiety. So even children who are very talented and gifted educationally are feeling pressure and anxiety. Kids who are low on the innate talent spectrum are feeling pressure and anxiety. And it's going to require a lot of work on the part of our frontline educators to recognize that, to recognize their own experience of what it's doing to them, and to rise above all of that to be able to attend to the basic needs of kids so that we're understanding these competing forces, the need to succeed and be accomplished, but also the need to feel safe and secure and peaceful. And the teacher who's going to be able to recognize that and help to create some self-soothing, help to create a nurturing, safe environment that has a healthy level of competition, because we need competition. We just don't need the competition that drives kids to feel inadequate.
So can you talk about what a classroom would look like? Because again, I think the people listening are nodding along with you, and they've heard this before. So now we know the problem. What is the solution? If you were teaching right now and you had the pressure to test coming down on you, you knew it was expected, what would you do, or what do you do when you consult with teachers to get them to say, hey, here's a classroom that the kids want to be in. This is a classroom you want to go to every day. And it's also an environment where learning will occur. So we will hopefully hit the test.
Well, I'll tell you about a school or district in the Midwest that I'm very impressed with. It's Kilcata Elementary School, and it's on a Native American reservation. And about a year ago, they had a traumatic incident. There are two types of trauma, or at least stress. There's acute and chronic. Right? Acute is that severe, sharp experience like what they experienced, which was a shooting. But it's also the kind of chronic stress that comes with what they have, which is chronic alcoholism, teachers feeling disempowered, the pressure of the system. So they had two types of stress, and it's created a system in which teachers are not sticking around very long, and the students are not feeling very good. But there's a guidance counselor there who's done some tremendous work. She's brought in all kinds of creative strategies like yoga in the classroom, like meditation to help kids learn how to breathe. Because anxiety is largely, by and large, to oversimplify it, a result of overthinking. Again, very complex, but if we are driven by outcomes and we're doing too much thinking, and we're not able to regulate our emotions and pay attention to our needs, there's a good chance we're going to have some trapped energy, some pressure, which is ultimately going to result in anxiety. And what she's recognized is that the teachers and the students are both needing to experience a sense of inner peace, because the antidote to anxiety is peace. And if we can help children, like they're doing, learn how to pay attention to the signals their body gives them, right? Instead of symptoms, like we like to call them in Western society, and then rush them off to get medication, right? It's paying attention to what are they experiencing, and then making meaning of those messages. So if you're feeling tension in your shoulders, or your temperature is high, or your heart is racing, right? Let's interpret that in a way that makes sense. Let's let them learn how to use those messages to understand what basic needs aren't getting met, and then empower them to take those needs. And some of the things they've done in this district include teaching them creative problem solving, which means if they're struggling with another student or feeling unhappy at home, how to go about expressing that conflict in a way that makes sense to them. Not us as adults, but them. It might be artistically, it might be through dance, it might be through some kind of collaborative effort. Now listen, this isn't going to work for every school, because I think as soon as we start applying a one-size-fits-all paradigm, we're going to get ourselves in trouble. But that particular school district is doing wonderful work because they recognize the need to increase the level of mindfulness to balance out all the pressure of our headiness.
Now, are you familiar with the Mind Up curriculum? that what is it, Goldie Hawn is created and behind?
No, tell me.
Yeah, the Mind Up curriculum. And if my wife would ever hop on here, she's quite the expert in this. But it's quite funny that you think of Goldie Hawn as somebody who doesn't quite know what they're doing, but her thing was the same thing. Let's look at education. What can we change? And it's all about mindfulness. Do you want to write in here a couple things?
Houston ISD also incorporated some of the Mind Up techniques, and so I'm in an IB school, and so all the IB schools they incorporated the Mind Up curriculum as well, and it's pretty cool. It taught all the teachers basically through the training some simple strategies to use for their with their students to teach them what mindfulness is and how to kind of come back and refocus when certain traumatic things happen, when stressors come about, when tests come about. And so it did give them those strategies to kind of be able to refocus. And so I thought it was a great curriculum. So this past year was kind of like our test year, and I'm pretty sure we're going to continue it next year.
Well, that's wonderful. A simple mindfulness technique for anybody out there who's listening who has heard the term but doesn't necessarily understand it. It originally came from Zen Buddhism. That's where a lot of our appreciation for balancing the brain and the body came from. And a simple technique with children, or even an adult, is if you're eating or drinking, you pay attention to the temperature, the texture, the sensations of it going down your throat and in your stomach. And you sit and you listen to what your body is responding to during that simple phase of eating. And what that does is it gets us to slow down our eating, to increase our breath while we're ingesting the food, to listen to our body's reactions to the food, instead of what we do now, and I'm guilty of it myself, is rushing it down. And as teachers, you probably have experienced out there yourselves this hurried experience of eating to get back to your task. So it's a nice place to start because it's an easy thing to remember.
Yeah, we know from dieting and from healthy eating that if you're not paying attention to what you're eating, and I'm talking about reading while you do it, surfing the internet, eating while you're watching a movie, you consume more calories just simply because you're not aware of what's going on. There's a lot of studies that say put everything away, concentrate on what you're eating, and that way you really focus on what's going in your body. Because, I know myself, I can take 1,000 calories without even blinking an eye sometimes. I look down and I go, where'd the bag go? Where did all this? So I do think mindfulness there is huge. So
if we don't listen to our bodies, we don't even know when we're satiated, when we're full. Right?
Absolutely.
We'll eat beyond that. Yeah.
So now I like it. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Jorge.
I was just going to say, I like how you said that you have to pay attention to the signals that your body is sending you, and that's something that I try to teach my kids as a physical education teacher. That when they do feel stressed out, that it's sometimes a good idea to exercise or get some activity or movement involved in their lives. How important do you think it is to have a regular exercise routine and teach that to our kids, that the importance of movement?
Great question. I think physical education is going to be more important now than at any time in our history, because health and physical education are going to be what saves children from a lifestyle of chronic inflammation, and which is the cause of most illness. And because we're in a world right now where we eat processed foods, where foods are becoming genetically modified more and more, where sugar is the number one addictive substance in the world, more addictive than crack and heroin, that if we don't teach kids how to take care of their bodies, if we don't give them outlets to be able to discharge some of that distress, if we don't help them learn how to improve their conditioning, because you know better than anybody, health, wellness, these are not all the same things. And if we're going to teach kids in order to be emotionally healthy, they have to be physically healthy as well. Look like someone joined us.
Hey, Justin, we can't hear you.
Yes, Dr. Ballard, what's going on? Nice to see you down there.
I had to pull over the car so I could get here and talk a minute.
Couldn't do it while you were driving?
Excited. Hey, so
Thank you. Good question. We, in the therapy field, there's a common expression that says, meet the person where they are. And what that's always meant to me is that if someone is stuck in a certain place, whether it's a certain kind of thinking or a certain kind of experiencing of the world, the job is not to pull them away from that, talk them out of it, convince them of something else. The goal is to pull up right alongside that person and understand their experience, their needs, their fears. I take that same philosophy into consulting with schools. So if a district has a particular set of expectations and they're trying to balance that out with the needs of the individuals, the parents, the teachers, the children, they're going to feel a sense of pressure to please everybody. So if we want to get their attention, we need to speak to them in a language that they understand, meet them where they are. And right now, that's data-driven. So if we want to help them appreciate the value of health and physical education, it's going to require having enough data out there, coordinated data that really helps explain the links, the correlations between emotional health, physical health, and learning. I don't know how much of that is out there, but that's, as an administrator, what would get my attention, because as an administrator, I'd say, well, if I've got this substantial data, I'm not making a judgment call anymore that people can be upset with me about. I'm using validated research in order to make an informed decision.
Yeah, and I did come across that data before, and I'll share that with you after this. I wrote a blog about it because I don't think enough administrators really understand how much information there is out there that shows all about the health benefits and then how it does affect the test scores, which is what they seem to care about right now. So getting back to an earlier statement you talked about, where you talked about treating the symptoms, you're very big into Gestalt, if I said that correctly, theory, where from what I understood, and again, you're going to talk about this much better than I will, but what I understand from your professional development is that you want to look at the root of the problems, not so much the symptoms that are occurring. So I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but do you value Gestalt over cognitive behavior, or do you think they work hand in hand? What are
I'm glad you remembered that, because it is the foundation of my approach to helping. And it's based on what's called the paradoxical theory of change, that if we don't fully appreciate what something is, then we're not going to be able to help affect any kind of change in a meaningful or sustainable way. Nor do we even know if change is necessary. We tend to be a reactive kind of society. A problem happens, we rush in with solutions. A lot of that is because politicians, right, are in need of keeping people, their constituency, supportive of them. And if they see the politician not doing anything, they're not going to feel like they're being effectual. So we tend to react and overreact much of the time when it comes to responding to problems. My belief is that we have to fully appreciate what's going on, whether it's a child who's having anxiety in the classroom, right? Let's understand what the nature, the etiology of it is, because there could be 6 different causes of that anxiety. The child could be gifted and bored and feeling lost. The child could have a learning disability and be feeling like they're falling behind because they're not getting it. They could be having problems at home. The list goes on and on and on. So if we don't first fully understand what's creating this problem, whether it's on a systemic level within schools or a whole educational system, on a family level or on an individual level, we're going to be applying solutions before we're understanding what really is needed. And oftentimes, it's understanding the problem that actually leads to the solution anyway. In most of my work with people, for instance, I did a training recently with a wonderful group of teachers in the area, and I spent the majority of time talking about intimacy and conflict. There's a term called constructive differencing that I'm very, very fond of, because in my belief, we don't teach kids how to negotiate differences well. People and children are threatened by differences, meaning they wind up aligning with people who are similar to them, think, feel, act similarly, And then if someone is different from them, it becomes a threat, and they treat it like a threat. If we can teach children and adults how to stay engaged, how to stay connected, even through their differencing, well, we're going to have a better chance of having better problem solvers and negotiators. So that's a long-winded explanation for saying that if we're going to get people to understand how to work through problems, we have to help them understand what the nature of that problem is. And that's what I did with that particular training recently. I spent a lot of time helping people understand our resistance to intimacy, our discomfort with conflict, and all the steps we take to circumvent it, as opposed to learning how to raise our tolerance for distress to navigate through it. Because oftentimes it's not a technique, it's just having a greater capacity to deal with discomfort. And if we can elevate that, which is always my number one goal in individual therapy or working with a system, then we can improve resiliency. And if we can improve resiliency, we're going to reduce the amount of emotional distress, behavioral problems. Does that make sense the way I described it?
No, absolutely. But then the next question is, how do we elevate it?
How do we elevate the stress? Well, if you're talking about the individual teacher, it's going to be a little bit different. The individual teacher is going to elevate their capacity for distress firstly by being understanding of their experience. So for instance, if a child is having a behavior problem, we always want to assume first that that behavioral problem is driven by some unmet need. And that unmet need remains unmet because they're not able to articulate what they're feeling, they're not able to negotiate it, they feel powerless. And as a frontline teacher, we can first understand their experience. Wow, you really about what you did, or you were really angry when you said that to me. Well, we're going to help a child feel disarmed. They're going to feel interested and curious. They're going to feel supported by us. It's going to reduce their tension state because now they don't feel like they have to fight or prove themselves. So there's no more important strategy than helping a person feel understood, to lower their defenses and to elevate their receptivity. Because once the emotionality goes down, logic and reason will start kicking in. So that's always the first step.
Nice. Jorge?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, could you talk a little bit about the differences between anxiety, fear, panic, and worry?
I like to think of fear as an intrinsic response to a real threat. The illustration that always comes into my mind for some odd reason, if there's a bear knocks on my door, I'm going to be afraid. It's a real threat. The bear may not have a key.
The first
still,
thing you'd be afraid of is,
door,
how did the bear learn how to knock? You know, why is it
GMOs, probably. If we recognize that fear is okay and that it's an intrinsic response to a threat and usually goes away when that threat is gone, we can now separate fear out from the other categories. And the next one would be worry, which is also a intrinsic response. We know perhaps we're getting test results back from the physician's office, and we're worried that the results aren't going to be good because we haven't been feeling well. So again, it's a real threat, real potential threat that we're having a sort of an appropriate or an expected reaction to.
Fear is when it's right there. So you see it, it's right in front of you. That's when the fear kicks in. Worry is still real, just like that fear, but it's not right in front of you yet. You're worried that it's coming.
Wonderful. It's a wonderful sort of restatement of it.
No,
much
you're
clearer
good.
than what I said.
The sort of physical versus perceived?
Well, when we get into perceived, we start to talk about anxiety, because anxiety may be in response to something real or something perceived. We're not quite sure, but because we do a lot of either rumination, which is looking back at the past and trying to make sense of it or rework it, or anticipatory, which is looking ahead into the future and trying to predict it, in both instances, we're trying to reconcile something that we're not certain about, whether it's an actual or a perceived kind of threat. And that's the difference. Whereas panic is the fear of fear. And I really would not use fear in the definition, but it's a reaction to our own discomfort. We start to feel anxiety, it accumulates, it compounds into this sort of tightly woven ball, and now we become afraid of something happening in response to being anxious, passing out, having a heart attack, embarrassing ourselves in public, and that's what panic is.
And what about anxiety? I missed that. Can you restate that?
Yeah, anxiety is a real or perceived response. Sort of a real response to a perceived or an actual threat. So it's the anticipation of something bad happening, or it's the ruminating about something that's already happened. And it generally means we're overthinking it. It means we're magnifying it. It means we're preparing ourselves
now,
for the
what is
worst.
the difference between anxiety and worry? That's where they seem to go very closely aligned.
Worry will come and go. Worry is more temporal. It's generally in response to a particular situation or event, where anxiety can be more diffuse, means it gets more spread out. It can be generalized anxiety, which is we just have lots of different anxieties about lots of different things, which don't always make sense, and they're not always clear, and they don't seem to be related to something immediate. We could be anxious about driving to work, but yet there are no storms. The car is in good shape. We know how to get there. So anxiety is something it's called confabulating, or we're creating within ourselves. It's a process that we're generating from within, as opposed to what most people see it as an affliction. It's not an affliction. It's a way in which we're dealing with the world, and way in which we're preparing for worst case scenarios.
Now, do you see kids having these things more and more now in your practice?
Yeah, I think anxiety in children is probably one of the fastest growing issues we've seen. But again, that's a small sample, and I'm not as closely involved in that because of my work, with the educational system. But from talking with teachers, from hearing from other clinicians, I'm hearing a lot more anxiety, and it seems to be generated by the high expectations kids put on themselves, not always from parents, which seems to in some ways be tied into some of the systemic changes as well.
Jorge, any questions? Anything popping up in your head? I have a million more, but I want to make sure that I give you an opportunity over here.
No, go ahead, and I'll pop in if I do.
Sure. All right. So now we take it where you're in the education system. You know what's going on. You became the doctor. Now you decided, hey, I want to start offering professional development to teachers. So can you talk a little bit in school districts? Can you talk about what you created and what your vision for it is? Because I've been blown away so far in the videos that I've watched, although I haven't filled out the forms. I promise you I will do that. And where did this come from? Where did you see a need for it? Because like I said, this could be a game changer.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. Well, if we just look at anxiety as an instance, right, is that we have teachers who are struggling to fulfill the requirements of their job. We've got expectations from parents, growing expectations that we do a good enough job teaching, educating our children. We've got the pressures of administration that are coming down from the top levels of our educational system. And it's created higher levels of perfectionism, higher levels of paying attention to our thinking as opposed to our feeling, reduced capacity for distress, as we talked about earlier, being more future-oriented so that we're trying to predict problems before they happen, disconnect from others in the world. So all of these kind of issues we see not just in children and in anxiety like we were talking about, but we're seeing in adults and educators. And my belief is that I sort of boiled it down to a simple analogy I think of, which is that if a child comes to school stressed, their learning may be impacted. Well, if a teacher comes to school stressed, their teaching may be impacted. And in the research that I've been doing, I've been gathering up data to see if this is supported by teachers out there, and it was actually an overwhelming response. So far, it's about 97.3% of the teachers that I've surveyed believe that our health and wellness at home impacts our work in the classroom. And because of that, I've try to rework our model of professional development. Because right now the existing model focuses on skill building, it focuses on the mandates, but it does little for engagement with students, which, as we talked about earlier with the Gallup study and the lack of engagement of students, is an important question, especially when we have children who are sometimes difficult to reach. We need to get better at learning how to draw these kids in. We've got the low attention span, we've got immediate gratification like we talked about earlier. So it's imperative that teachers are well armed, well equipped to learn how to engage a student in all different types of students. And that's not something that educational training focuses on nearly as much as the skills. And then lastly, the fourth aspect of professional development needs to be behavioral health. If we're going to expect our teachers to accomplish all of this under all the pressure that they're under, we have to help support them emotionally, mentally, and that's where this project comes in. This project is embedding personal growth with professional development, integrating these ideas in one platform so that teachers can get help inside and outside of the classroom in every aspect of their life: health, wellness, nutrition, finance, legal issues. And what I really love about this project is it's free. Schools don't pay a dime for this. Teachers don't pay a dime for this because honestly, we have a $1 trillion educational business industry. $1 trillion. And nationwide, it's almost $4.5 trillion. Why shouldn't schools be taking some of this money? So what I did was I took this model, this free model, and I said, well, not only should it be free, but why can't schools share in the revenue? If we could create self-sustaining schools, remember we talked about earlier those three big philanthropists, these billionaires who are infusing all this money to influence the nature of education, which is away from what we know to be important, like curriculum and teacher training. Then we need to combat that by helping make schools financially self-sufficient. Then they can compete for the best teachers. They can get the best technology. They're going to be in a better equipped to be able to bring in teachers. They have better student-to-teacher ratio. So what Teacher Coach does is it shares the revenue with schools, so that schools can actually become financially self-sufficient, which has never happened in the history of education. So I'm very proud of it because I feel like I'm doing something which has the potential to affect millions of lives. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're creating parent portals so that schools can offer training, this online training on health and wellness and parenting and finance to the families in their community. It embeds directly into the school district website where they can brand it and have access to it and make sure it's monitored. Experts from around the country, authors, professors at universities, all kinds of well-established. I've been talking with some national teacher organizations as well who are starting to work on partnership agreements with us too, so that we can have the most wonderful training ever seen in this model, so that we're strong both in the delivery method and in the
so
content as well.
where do you see the money coming from, though? That's where I'm a little confused. So if it's free for the teachers and it's going to be free for the parents, where is this revenue source coming from?
What happens is that the average school administrator is solicited, and this actually happens for teachers also, but the average school administrator is solicited multiple times a week, even a day, by vendors. People looking to sell a service or a product to a school. Textbook companies, software companies, you name it. Ask your administrator how many times that they are solicited, and they'll tell you it really eats up their time during the day. So with our model, if the school can turn one of those solicitors into a sponsor, which means they get to sponsor a course. So if the course is on mindfulness-based education, this course brought to you by Joe's Textbook Company. Now the textbook company gets what they want, which is more eyeballs, more awareness about their product, which helps with their branding because they're being affiliated with a service that schools are going to love. And they get the exposure, they get people coming to their company or to their website. And it's like any other kind of advertising, but the difference is they know that this money in part is going to the school system, which makes them even more willing to do it than ever before. So they get better exposure and they know that they're supporting the school in a way they haven't. And that's the revenue sharing model that allows schools to become financially
All
self-sufficient.
right, so you're saying if I want to sell whatever it is to school systems, I'm going to advertise through your site because I know that those are teachers and educators and parents that are going to be watching those videos. So now I know the exact market and the exact type of people that I'm trying to get my product to. All right.
And I've been trying to stay away from the word advertise because it's really a sponsorship model where they can follow a particular brand to investigate what kind of service it is, because I don't want a very commercial looking type of site because that would be a sort of a turnoff, but it does need to have enough of that to be able to subsidize it for what we talked about.
Nice. So what PD is going to be offered to people? I know you talked about financial.
Four different areas.
Financial, mental, emotional.
We're going to have a category for family issues, which is everything from parenting to finance to issues of retirement, anything related to a family. Then there's going to be a self area. The self area is health, wellness, addictions, emotional problems, physiological problems, courses from physicians, anything that has to do with the individual. A relational area that has all kinds of work on communication, intimacy, conflict resolution, courting. We're creating courses right now on what it's like to be a single person in this era and how to navigate the life of finding a partner. It's a wonderful course being offered by a young female psychologist. And then the work area, which encompasses dealing with policy changes, dealing with administration, teacher leadership, all the mandated courses. That's one area we're very proud of, is we're trying to take all the courses that are required by law, by state, or by the municipality, and making them fun, making them interesting, so that teachers are no longer going to be bored and turned off when it's time to do something like bloodborne pathogens. So we make it funny. There's a physician that teaches that class, and it's hysterical. So we're trying to find.
Yeah, you showed it to us in professional development. Listen, bloodborne pathogens is not a fun topic to go over, but it was really interesting, really engaging. Talked about like 1,000 bees going there, and it had me. It was actually a very good delivery method, and for me, usually you have my attention for like 30 seconds, and I don't know, a butterfly comes by, and I start looking around. It was really cool, so I loved that one. I thought that was such a great idea because we do the bloodborne pathogens every year forever. That's one of the state mandates.
If we're going to expect teachers to engage students, then we have to engage teachers, and we can't just put this boring training in front of them and expect that they're going to be stimulated and take in the material. There's a question on the board. It says how to work and do 2 jobs and date. And it's interesting because that is what many people are going through, is trying to balance out all these tremendous challenges in life. And it's tough to do that all and still to maintain one's health. So part of the reason we did this project is to make it more efficient. Now teachers can take their training from home, from a cell phone, from a tablet. They don't have to just do it in the classroom. And they can have contact with the person developing the course. So it's actually a hybrid model, not just these static online classes, but this interactivity, coaching, and webinars. So the people out there, like one of the people who are watching, who are working that hard to balance that all, I really applaud you, because it is not easy to do all that and still maintain peace and happiness. And my job is to support the most important profession on the planet, and that's the nature of this work.
Is there anything also that you're thinking about or down the line for students as well, so that they can kind of benefit from those things as well?
Well, the parent portal will have courses for students. My children have been chomping at the bit to help me create courses for other kids. But I do have a social networking site called ufeud.com. And the idea of ufeud is to help us learn, especially young people, how to go about approaching differences in a way which celebrates the difference, becomes curious. Curiosity to me is the #1 trait that we can use to improve conflict resolution. If we get curious about why someone is different, how come they have the belief, what drove them to do what they do, we're going to be able to engage those differences. And if we do that, we're going to develop a deeper level of intimacy, because it's actually differences that create closeness, not sameness, sustainable difference. So youfeud.com is a project that I'm working on to be able to help people learn how to navigate differences. And it's in its early stage. There's a lot of work done. It's a little bit antiquated in terms of the look, and the whole self-awareness tool about learning about how we differ is being built. But I'm hoping that's going to be a project that addresses the needs of students.
All right, so can we go to, you talked about with the students, how we need to engage them, and they're all different types. What are some ways that teachers can raise their engagement and step their game up in that area? Because it is very difficult. A lot of teachers came through the system of sitting for, hours on end and kind of expect the students to do that. It's kind of unrealistic for most of our students. Some of them learn how to play school, but others it's just a problem all the time. It will never cease to be a problem. What are some ways that they can engage the students?
Some of that question is going to be answered by understanding our own strengths and limitations. For instance, if we have a particular strength of humor, if we have a particular strength of being a good listener, we're going to access some of those strengths. That's sort of the simple answer. But I think the more complicated answer is to understand how the student sees us, or to turn it around, understanding ourself in relation to the other. If I know a student, or if I sense a student is experiencing me as an authority figure, as a disciplinarian, as someone who potentially can get them in trouble, as someone who reminds them of someone in their family who they're unhappy with, as someone who represents the potential to help them feel safe and secure, if we understand how they are experiencing us, we're going to go very far into engagement, because that's going to allow us to communicate with them about what their needs are, help them recognize that we see the feelings and the needs that underpin the behavior, that we're going to stay away from judgment and criticism and being punitive as much as we can. We're going to hold them accountable because we care. But deep down, we're going to understand who they are as people, what drives their actions. I'll give you, for instance, today I was meeting with a mother and daughter. And the daughter had cut herself a couple times, and the vice principal called the parent in and said she's been bullying other kids. And she's been doing it for a while. And when the mom said, I want to know, why are you bullying? Why would you do that to other kids? That's a terrible thing to do. The young girl said to her, well, it's because you guys are fighting all the time at home, because no one listens to me. No one understands what I'm feeling. And the mom said to her, that's ridiculous. You have to take ownership for your behavior. Now, there's an element of that which makes sense, which is taking ownership of our behavior and not blaming someone else. But the mom was doing the very same thing that she was telling the daughter not to do, which is not paying attention to her feelings. Kids are not terribly complicated. If we understand them, and we do it in a way which is not patronizing, which is not judgmental, but get on their level and really become interested and curious about their experience, they'll value us, they'll open up to us, they'll trust us, and those are all the components of engagement.
And I love when you said it's not terribly complicated. I love teaching elementary school because their problems are generally very simple and easily solved. And when I get out of my gym and when I go in the real world and deal with actual problems that have many layers that I don't understand, it frustrates me. I'm like, why can't we just rock, paper, scissors this and get on to the next thing?
I would add on, though, that if we help them solve the problem through their own resources, they're going to feel much greater value and worth, as opposed to if we provide the solutions. Because we don't want them to become dependent on us to learn how to figure something out. We want them to come to us to appreciate the process. How do we help them harness their own resources? How do we help them evaluate their own decision making? How do we help them become more accountable to themselves? That ultimately is the best way to help children solve problems.
There's a program called Structured Recess, and Jorge, I'll let you speak 1 second. Sorry to cut you off. That I'm really trying to get going in my school next year, where 2 or 3 days a week during recess, I set up the games for them so they could choose whether it would be flag football, a parachute, Newcomb, whatever games they want. There'd be 3 options. They would run their games, and I would have an aide and myself overseeing the games, but I don't want to step in and solve every problem for the student. I want them to be able to work it out. And I think that's a huge part of our phys ed classes, is allowing them the ability to say, hey, what can we do to help you solve it on your own versus me stepping in every 2 minutes, go, no, we can't do this. When they come to me, the first thing I do is, did you say something to that person that there's the problem? Because that person might not even know. I mean, a quick example is they slapped me. Well, we were playing a tag game. They tagged you a little harder than you were comfortable. But if you didn't tell that person immediately, first of all, they forgot it because it was a minute or two ago. They're already on to the next thing. But right away, you could let them know, and now they go, oh, okay, and they could put the association there.
That's terrific. That's terrific. It's really, it's creative, and it does go back to another difference between Singapore and the United States. In the United States, we focus a lot on what happened at that point in history, what happened between the two of you, and we try to solve the problem by analyzing it. What they focus on is the how. How did you go about dealing with it? How is it effective? And whether it's learning in the classroom or learning socially, that ultimately is going to get kids to become more self-sufficient rather than relying on us to solve the problems for them.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of go back to the student motivation part, and it kind of goes into what Justin was talking about. I just finished reading the book Drive by Daniel Pink, and he talks about student motivation and engagement, and well, just really for everybody in general. But he talks about the three big aspects of that being autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I was just wondering, how much do you think that plays a role in, you know, our classrooms and how we construct our classroom and our environment in our classroom, adding those three things to provide students with that motivation and engagement that they need?
Yeah, that's terrific. I was recently talking with my wife, who's a psychologist as well, about my daughter's second grade class, and they had to come home with a reading list, and then they had to each night write down what books that they had read, and then they were rewarded if they read a certain number of books. Now, mastery, right? Perhaps because we're helping them get better through the accumulated experience, but it doesn't help them with the intrinsic motivation. That's the piece that concerns me, because if we reward something that we want internally to be rewarding, then we can actually reduce long-term motivation. So one of the things we want to pay attention to as educators is how to create internal motivation as opposed to only giving rewards. And sometimes we get complacent, so we provide lots of external incentives and disincentives to do or not do something. And instead of over time pulling those back and allowing the child to create their own sense of motivation, we keep them dependent on that. And it might be easier because it's a system, it's a structure, it's in place. But we really want to taper that back over time. And that actually is what develops greater
mastery. So do you also think that by providing that extrinsic motivation, that it also kind of feeds that entitlement feeling and feeds into that whole, you know, instant gratification that the students that we see in our students more so nowadays?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if there's any quality beyond entitlement that teachers struggle with more. It is just such a turnoff for adults to be interacting with a child who feels like they're just expecting it. Whether it's this award system that we've sort of moved to where everybody gets rewarded with something, or it's what I described, which is, you know, you get these points for reading books, and it can have the antithetical effect that we're looking for. It can actually reduce that internal drive, and you're absolutely right, that can certainly feed into the other problems that we talked about.
When you and your wife argue, do you sit there and just analyze everything each other is doing? I couldn't imagine I'll just get in an argument. Oh, it must be amazing.
Well, hopefully you get the sense that I try to do very little analysis, because if I'm analyzing, I'm in my head. And if I'm in my head, I'm not experiencing the needs, the feelings, I'm not listening to our body. There's a really interesting experiment I do with people where I tell them to tell me 2 foods that they love and 1 food that they hate. and I say, tell me each of the three as if it's a fact. So if I hate cauliflower, I'm ultimately saying, yes, I love pizza, I love chicken wings, and I love cauliflower. And then I ask them to pay attention to the difference in their body when they told the lie, because ultimately the body never lies. The head lies all the time because the job of the brain is to protect us. So when people are anxious, they're in hyper-protective mode because they're always thinking of worst-case scenarios. So I don't analyze, and I try not to do too much of that because that's the very thing that I think is driving up the rates of unhappiness and anxiety in people.
Nice. Now, I know we're wrapping it up, and thank you very much for putting in the time you have so far. Do you have any advice to give to someone who's married to another teacher and how, when they get home and they've been talking all day and the energy levels are low, how to keep communication up?
I couldn't respond to that, but I may have to meet your wife someday, and I don't want to get in trouble with her.
All right. For one thing, how can school districts get a hold of you? How can they get you in? How can they pick your brain? How can they get Dr. Scherz to be a part of their school district?
Teachercoach.com is the website that we are moving out of our beta phase because we're using all the pilot study results to figure out what the teachers liked and what they didn't like to be able to use the summer to revamp the project. And we've already got some wonderful feedback, but the site is live. And if people want to email me at coach@teachercoach.com, I'd be happy to talk with them about something that they're struggling with individually or something systemically that they're looking to address, and seeing if myself or someone on my staff might be able to help guide them.
Nice. So we have a lot of phys ed people that are listening, health people that are listening, that run their state conference or big parts of their state conference. Are you available to show up to the conferences to do presentations? I know we're in Jersey. You're about 20 minutes from me. Would you travel to the conference if it was within a relative close proximity to you?
Yeah, I do a select number of conferences each year. I try to alternate a bit because, again, I have young children at home too, so I don't want to be on the road too much. Last year I did one very interesting, the National Bullying Conference in Florida, which was terrific, a wonderful conference for folks, a lot of health and phys ed teachers there. But I do go to a select number of year depending on the nature of it and the timing of it, etc.
Nice, because once this gets rolling, I know some of the areas don't. The videos you have are not fully stocked yet. Because I was looking through them tonight, looking at different ones. Once they are, I think there's a resource that should be amplified, that should be brought out there and shown to teachers that, hey, you have this fantastic resource that's available for free. And the only one of the best ways is obviously it'll come out through the podcast, but state conferences are fantastic for that. So we have Lynn in the house. Lynn, do you have a question for Dr. Scherz?
No, just trying this.
All right. Welcome to Blab. No worries. And thank you for joining us. All right, Jorge. Any last questions before we let Dr. Scherz hit the road?
A lot of the stuff that you were talking about kind of reminded me of Stoicism. Is there any root to your philosophy in Stoicism, or is that just kind of a nice coincidence?
Well, it's a whole nother topic, but I believe that we ought to be teaching philosophy in schools, because if we're going to just tell kids what values are important, right? Every school has a value system and morals and a code of conduct. But if we don't actually teach them how those values were derived, whether it's Taoism or Stoicism, whether it's Zen Buddhism, whether it's from Aristotle, right? There are a lot of important philosophies out there, but that was the origin of all the therapies, including Gestalt. And it's really where our moral and value systems come from. So while Stoicism is really less attention to emotion, trying to create more reason, I would say my philosophy is probably a little bit more closely associated with Zen Buddhism, which is more about balance and peace and the middle road. But I think all philosophies are important because everybody's different, and there's not one right set of beliefs and principles and paradigms by how we live our life. But if we can understand how they were formed, how they came to be, we'll learn a whole lot more about how to negotiate with people who are different from us.
Awesome. So if you have any last words of advice or anything you'd like to say to all the teachers that are out there, what would it be?
Well, the summer's coming up, so I hope teachers do a wonderful job of taking care of themselves this summer, whether that's through nutrition or improving their relationships or getting some time just to be peaceful. That I know it's a long school year and you're probably burnt out with kids. You may even want to go home and ignore your own children. It's okay to take care of yourself, right? If you don't take good care of yourselves, how can you take care of others?
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Scherz, thank you so much. Time flew by. I'm sure as I listen to this and lay in bed tonight, 24,000 more questions will pop in my head. I will be emailing you at some point in time, and we really, really appreciate it. Jorge, anything else?
No, that's all. Just thank you so much for coming on the show, and great information. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for what you guys do. You guys are doing the hard work. It's easy for me.